Thank you, Anne, and thank you to the conference organising committee for the opportunity to provide a response to Anne's keynote. So the situation of agri-food production systems was set out and framed as a challenge to be addressed rather than a problem to be solved. Themes around farming, consumers, disruptions and data were all raised as part of this challenge. Anne took us to the blank canvas of Mars, which I think was helpful to stop us in our tracks. To rethink food production systems and acknowledge that every molecule counts, whether that be on Mars or here on planet Earth. Anne encouraged us to think about how we would create agri-food production systems if we could start again and benefit from all the mistakes that we've made in the past. It was suggested that we think more broadly than what the planet can do for us, but rather what we can do for the planet. And Anne considered this under four major headings of on-farm optimisation, scientific infrastructure, sharing farm data, and indeed food safety. In terms of on-farm optimisation, we were introduced to the Cool Soils initiative, whereby farmers, scientists, and indeed industry are collaborating with the shared objective of learning about soils and their health, measuring, managing and learning. In this case study, the spotlight was on changing behaviours around curiosity, networks, farm operations and learning. A second project was mentioned, the On-Farm Experimentation Project, which is being run in Western Australia. While this project goes beyond soils, it is about grain production systems and how farmers can change their attitudes and behaviours towards data and analytics to learn more from their production systems. When it comes to scientific infrastructure, Anne considered the question, where does the innovation come from? It was suggested that innovation comes from base stations like the global network of smart farms. An example of this was the Food Agility CRC's investment and support of the Global Digital Farm in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. This is similar to the Hands-Free Hectare project at Harper Adams University in the UK and provides evidence of the importance of locations where people, not just farmers, can learn and experiment with agri-food production systems at scale. The Global Digital Farm and the Hands-Free Hectare are about automation and examining how digital systems can drive food production systems. Humans, however, are not redundant here. In fact, they remain the driving force in the decision-making and learning that is yielded from scientific infrastructure such as this. Sharing data is a ubiquitous problem that has created much commentary since the advent of inter-firm data linkage and the realisation of the benefits of collaborative supply chains. The problem has its roots in governance and intellectual property, whereby trust is a major factor when data are shared. Against this background, Anne cited advances being made in Australian agriculture, such as the National Farmers Federation Farm Data Code and the Food Agility CRC's Best Practice Data Policy. While these are both voluntary initiatives, they constitute important signals to verify that innovation is safe, and research organisations like the Food Agility CRC are at the forefront of ethical practice as well as ethical science. Catherine Marriott, the CEO of the Riverine Plains Farming Systems Group, was quoted as saying, "There's no point in making changes if you're going to go broke making them." This sentiment can be extended to food safety, and Anne makes the point that there's no point in making changes if you're not going to produce food that's safe to consume. As a university staff member, regulation and compliance are the bane of my professional existence. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many people in the audience. So I can fully appreciate how regulations and compliance can be easily perceived as stiflers of innovation, particularly when it comes to food safety and new food production processes. So what we're seeing about Anne's example here is the emphasis Dairy Food Safety Victoria is putting into innovating around the barriers of regulation and compliance. This is interesting and important. This is an interesting, important acknowledgement that farmers are a part of intricate webs of interdependencies that make up our agri-food systems. Anne recognised this at the beginning of her presentation. No one and no stakeholder can operate in isolation. And this is based on the premise that supply chains operate on flows. Flows of product, flows of finance, and indeed flows of data. Indeed, Professor Martin Christopher's adage that it's no longer individual businesses that compete for competitive advantage, but entire supply chains that compete for competitive advantage rings very true here. Dairy Food Safety Victoria and the RegTech project are paving the way for Victoria and Australian milk being market leaders when it comes to regulatory compliance. Anne's keynote closes with an issue that is of particular interest to me, the human aspect of food production, supply chains and decision making. I previously noted that despite advances in automation, humans are not redundant from the agri-food system. In fact, it's arguable that they're more important than ever. Back in 1973, Ruth Gasson published her seminal paper on the goals and values of farmers. It's one of my all-time favourites. I expect Ruth Gasson would marvel at Anne's keynote to see how far the motivations, goals and values of farmers have brought food production in the 50-odd years since the publication of her paper. Ruth would value the economic imperatives that the Cool Soils Initiative is considering and the shedding of independence that has resulted in farmer networks for knowledge exchange, like the Grower Group Alliance and the Food Agility CRC's on-farm experimentation project, where farmers are involved in the co-creation of science and not just recipients of science. I reiterate the point that humans are not redundant in the food system, nor are they a luxury. Co-creation of research and value addition through technology are allowing the responsible production of more agri-food products, but people and their decision-making are still major limitations of agri-food systems. Australia is expecting its biggest grain crop to be harvested over the next few months, and there is a frightening shortage of workers, not only to harvest the crop, but to provide the logistics of moving the crop from regional locations to ports as and when ships become available to export the crop. This problem is currently shared by many developed nations in all sorts of supply chains. Anne touched upon leadership and culture. Let me take a moment to present my point about this in the context of Australia and the cases that Anne discussed. The Australian landmass is approximately 7.7 million square kilometres, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that agricultural businesses occupy and manage 51% of this landmass. The nation is also characterised by some of the oldest and most depleted soils on Earth, as well as being amongst the most exposed to the effects of climate change. Also, Australia exports about 70% of the food it produces, which sounds a lot, but in terms of world trade volumes, it's actually very small. Despite this, Australia is able to successfully compete, very successfully I might add, on the quality of the food it produces. We struggle to compete on the basis of price because of our high input costs, so we must compete on the basis of quality. The determination of quality can be both objective and subjective. The protein content of bread and noodles can be easily measured, as can the fat content of milk and the intramuscular fat content of beef. Contemporary consumer preferences suggest that quality is far more than measurable product attributes. Quality is also determined by the ethics associated with production and manufacturing functions that go up the supply chain as far as stewardship of natural capital and the ethics of farm inputs like fertilisers and chemicals, and not to mention animal welfare. The founding fathers of manufacturing quality, yes, they were all fathers. There were no genders, no other genders represented on the team, were people like J. Edwards Deming and A.V. Feigenbaum, who not only focused on understanding and controlling variation in manufacturing systems, but also acknowledged right from the beginning of their work the importance of leadership, education, organisational commitment and culture in creating value from improving quality in many production systems and their wider supply chain. What we can see from Anne's presentation is evidence that Edwards Deming and Feigenbaum's philosophies are becoming real in the Australian agri-food context. Peter Drucker famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture is recognised as one of the most difficult aspects to change, and I can see real change emerging from the examples that Anne shared with us today. I see cultural change emerging from in the form of actors who accept the challenge of dealing with problems in the agri-food systems. In the past, agricultural research was bound to universities, government departments and farmers. Now we welcome anyone who can help solve our problems and support our challenges. I can see this cultural change playing out in the form of collaboration of framing ideas, creating plans, shared analysis of results, shared responsibility and shared learning. I might just give a shout out to Catherine Evans for her questions in the last session about who's involved. Hopefully this slide answers your question in a very succinct manner. Okay, so the diagram on the previous slide presents a great change in research practices and speaks to several questions. What is the purpose of agri-food systems research, and who has input into these agri-food systems research and its data analytics, and indeed who are the beneficiaries of agri-food systems research? And have agri-systems research actually gone beyond the domain of peer-reviewed scientific inquiry? From a personal point of view, I do hope so. Anne and I feature in this conference agenda under the data analytics theme. Sorry we haven't provided some new informatics or omics, but we're steadfast in our vision of the development of people, cultural change and leadership in the pursuit of sustainable agri-food systems. This most certainly includes the advancement of data and data analytics that provide the essential evidence basis for decisions to produce food on Mars, and the acknowledgement that every molecule counts, no matter where it is located. But data and data analytics are enablers, they're not the drivers. In closing, I wish to thank Anne and her colleagues for preparing this presentation today. More importantly, I'd like to thank Anne for her leadership in Australian agri-food systems and her place in the transformation of how data are driving the improvement of what we're doing now and how we're doing it. Anne Astin is a friend, colleague and mentor, and I'm ever grateful to benefit from her energy and wisdom. Thank you very much.